There's no humanitarian aid that's absent foreign aid, and oftentimes now with the war on terror, there's military involved and so on. And here's the thing you need to keep in mind with this, and this kind of goes back to one of my responses during the last session. The natural human emotion, which is human, so we shouldn't reject it, we should just recognize it. When we see people suffering is what? We need to do something to help them. That's kind of the common thing. You can understand why people have that reaction. Economics says this: no, you must not do something. You only do something if it actually is going to help the people. If it is going to cause more harm than good, in other words, harm people that are already suffering, then you want to refrain from it. Unless your end, of course, is to harm people, which it's supposedly not. It's to be humanitarian. So what I want to do in this lecture is to talk about efforts to assist those who are suffering. So let's talk about the reality of the world. There's lots of poor people. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm just regurgitating facts that you can Google for yourself just like I did. You'll hear statistics all the time of people that live on $1 or less a day or $2 less a day. Lots of people. So we can all agree there's poor people in the world. No one denies this. The question, of course, is what is the best means of assisting them given that they're poor? Again, when you bust out these statistics, you can see why people's reaction is, well, we need to help them. We're wealthy, they're poor, we must do something. We have a moral obligation to help them. Foreign aid, in other words, transfer of resources, whether it is monetary resources, whether it's goods and services from wealthy countries to poor countries, is considered a key part of US foreign policy. Foreign aid gets thrown around a lot, so very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just to give you guys some context, I want to tell you when economists or policymakers or those in the development community talk about foreign aid, there's 5 categories. And I'll go through these quickly. The percentage is an estimate about approximation, based on the recent data I could get, of the percentage of US overall foreign aid that goes to each of these categories. Bilateral is 2. Bilateral assistance, the direct transfer of aid from one government to another. The US government gives aid to the Afghan government. That's bilateral assistance. About 35%, so the biggest chunk. Why? Because the US government can control who gets it in that case. They can give it directly to them. Let me skip down to number 4 just because really it should be number 2 because it fits well with bilateral aid. The alternative is called multilateral aid. Multi is multiple parties. Multilateral aid is when the US government or another government gives aid to an international organization. Think the World Bank, think the IMF, and then that international organization, the members, following the rules of the organization, decide then how to allocate aid out to people. Multiple parties are involved. It's about 7%. Again, the reason why is what's the difference? Well, the US government can make direct decisions about who gets it here. Here they can't because they give it to the organization and the procedures that are governing the international organization are ultimately what determine how those resources are allocated. So the donors, if you will, lose direct control of it. Number 2 is a category that includes in a broad sense our foreign policy goals. Nation building, like we were just talking about, the war on terror and so on. Humanitarian aid is for short-term things. Post-earthquake Haiti, that's humanitarian aid. Anytime there's kind of a natural disaster or a crisis due to a drought or genocide, if there's people suffering and relief aid is sent, that falls under the category of humanitarian aid. You can see, by the way, how this gets blurry very quickly. Let me give you an example. People are suffering. If we, the US government, gives money to build a hospital, is that humanitarian aid or is it long-term development aid? You can make the argument for either one. On the one hand, it does provide short-term relief because you have a place to take care of people who are suffering. But you also might make the argument that it provides long-term care to people that then can engage in development practices and be a contributing member of society. So the way things are categorized varies. It gets more complicated because different governments categorize things differently. And finally, military aid. And that's military equipment the US government gives to other countries. Take a look at that if you ever have a chance, because it is among some of the most brutal governments in the world the US government gives and sells military equipment to. US assistance. About 150 countries, most, as I mentioned, are bilateral aid. From 89 to 2009, that decade, the largest recipients were Iraq, Egypt, Israel, and Afghanistan. You know, right off the bat, you should recognize that the US government is not humanitarian in some abstract sense. And I don't have the time to go through this, but the way you can know this is to look before this period. In an ideal world, the US government would look for the poorest people in the world and then figure out how to allocate their money to get the most bang for the humanitarian buck. But if you just look at the top 5, it switches all the time. Based on what? Who we care about. Iraq and Afghanistan were not on this list prior to the intervention, by the way. I guess the poor people there didn't matter that much. All of a sudden, we intervene, they're in the top 5. Why? Because we're spending all the money on nation building, development aid, humanitarian aid. Israel's not a poor country. That's purely for defense purposes, right? Pakistan, of course, one of the most brutal governments in the world, and the US government likes them because they allow the US to launch drones and other military strikes out of their country. So has assistance worked? Don't know. Economists disagree on this. Don't take my word for it. Here are 2 development economists on the anniversary of the Haitian earthquake and the relief that was provided. And here's basically what they say. Look, this was perhaps the largest international humanitarian effort in the history of mankind. It's a little troublesome that we don't know if we failed or succeeded. You can see why. If the goal is to help people, on some margins it was successful. Some people got water, some people got food, people got tents. But what else was promised? Bill Clinton, Sean Penn was involved for some reason. In any case, they promised things like, we're going to build it back better. That was the motto that got associated with Haiti. Right? Remember the quote from Louis Luck in the last presentation. The silver lining is we can put it back the way we've intended to all along. That, and it's a failure. But what about long-term aid? Here's how economists do this. Economists like to measure things even when you can't measure it, and then they like to run regressions because it gives them some sense of fake rigor. And here's what they do. They look at GDP, they look at foreign aid, they throw in a bunch of controls, and then they say, did foreign aid increase GDP? Yes or no? Well, guess what? Even on that supposedly rigorous scientific method, there's disagreement. There's something in economics, well, in social sciences in general, called meta-studies. A meta-study looks at a series of empirical studies on a certain area and tries to conclude certain trends based on all the studies. These authors looked at 68 econometric studies on foreign aid. And what do they say? Failed to have an effect. Right? So they look at the 68 econometric studies, they look at the results and say no effect. Well, in 2013, 2 authors looked at the same exact 68 studies, so not new ones, the same exact sample, and they come to the exact opposite conclusion. So what are we to do? Perhaps we should throw our hands up and go home and say we can say nothing about it. But if we did that, what would I talk about for the next however many minutes? And here's what I want to suggest to you. We have a lot to say about it, but empirics can't resolve the question. Because ultimately it's not an empirical issue. It's an economic issue that we can use economic theory not to answer once and for all, but to delineate the limits of what aid can and can't accomplish. Here's the problem, guys. How many of you have heard just the facts? I'm rigorous, I just focus on the data. I don't focus at all on value judgments or whether we should or shouldn't. Economists say this all the time. I'm concerned just with the data. That's what the data tells me. What's the problem with that? Well, data is a bunch of numbers. It doesn't tell you anything. In order to collect data, what do you need? Theory. GDP is total output. Do we include height in GDP? No. How do you know not to include height in GDP? Because we have a theory of what GDP is and what should be included in it. Absent that theory, we'd just be throwing together random numbers. Also, then we run our regressions. We have to then interpret them. How do we interpret them? We have a theory of what different relationships mean. Absent the theory, we can't interpret it and make policy. So theory must precede data by definition. What I want to suggest is that a focus on economic theory can go a long way in helping us delineate what aid can and can't accomplish. It can't answer all questions. And here's the thing, guys. The debate about whether, to kind of foreshadow, the debate over whether aid can or can't work is not the right question. As I mentioned before, spending money and keep doing something over and over, every once in a while you're going to get a good result. No one denies this. That's not the question, though. The relevant economic question is at what cost, and can you systematically provide aid to those in need? That's the relevant question. So on the face of it, the question is pretty straightforward. There's a technical problem. Little kids have vitamin A deficiency. We know vitamin A. We walk into Walmart and buy tablets. So the solution's pretty simple. We give them money. We multiply the cost of the vitamin A capsules by how many we want. We give them the aid or we send them the capsules, and then they take it, voila, problem solved. That's a pure technological problem. On paper, it seems very straightforward. If we just do that over all problems, will solve poverty once and for all, which is the promise made by many advocates of aid. But here's the thing. This neglects the human element, that humans spend the money, that they have knowledge problems. Do we know every problem facing people? Do we know how to allocate resources to their highest valued use? And what incentives do they face? Again, basic economic questions, the economic way of thinking, which I've been talking about all morning. So here's the thing. Here's the normal kind of thing that goes on with foreign aid. Some story catches the attention of those in the news, or some Hollywood star has a pet cause. They go on the news, they have a fundraiser, they take a picture and put it on the cover of the magazine, and all of a sudden people start talking about it. They raise some money and send it over there. And then somehow that's supposed to transform into development and growth and alleviating the suffering. But here's the thing. This neglects the economic way of thinking. It neglects the hard but basic and straightforward questions. What can and can't we do? Seems like that's a good starting point. I want to frame this for you in the context of a great book by the economic journalist Tim Hartford, works for the Financial Times. If you know kind of the popular economics literature, The Undercover Economist was another book that he's well known for, and he has others as well. Adapt, I like it because it's a basic framework for thinking about things. And if you listen to me right now, you will have on this one slide, see I can do things on one slide that will provide a framework for you to analyze any issue that comes up in your life. Not just even policy issues, relationships, work, school, whatever. We can apply this framework to it. Adapt. Here we go. Start from a premise that hopefully is not controversial, which is we are humans. Second, we are imperfect humans, which is we make mistakes. We are imperfect people. And that's the success starts with failure. Precisely because we're imperfect, we fail all the time. The relevant question is how adaptable is the system we're in? Whatever it is we're talking about, the system can be the economy, it can be your family, it can be the business you are part of or working, a nonprofit. That logic applies to everything. And here's what adaptability is driven by. A system is adaptable if there's feedback mechanisms. Why? If you're screwing up, you're making a mistake, you need to know you're making a mistake. If you don't know you're making a mistake, you can't change your behavior. So absent feedback loops, some indication that you are making an error, you'll continue to make errors. Step one. Step two, you have to have an incentive to correct that error. If you know if you're making an error, but you don't have an incentive to correct it, you will continue to make it because you don't have an incentive to change your behavior. An adaptable system is one that provides feedback and the incentive to act on that feedback. The reason this flows nicely is because the market process is the most adaptable system we know of. Why? A well-functioning market provides both the relevant knowledge that you are making a mistake, you're suffering a loss, people don't like what you're doing. Who's the people? Consumers, you and I. And it provides you an incentive to change your behavior. If you don't change your behavior, you will go bankrupt. There are hard constraints. That is a highly adaptable system. Socialism, in contrast, was not adaptable. Why? People lacked the relevant knowledge of what to produce, that they were making mistakes, and they didn't have an incentive to adjust their behavior. So it's all an issue of adaptability. So now we have a way of framing our discussion of humanitarian action. Here's the relevant question. How confident are you that the relevant context within which humanitarian action will take place is adaptable? That the supposed humanitarians have the relevant knowledge of who needs what the best allocation of resources is, and that they have an incentive to act on that knowledge. That's the question we need to ask. So let's talk about it. Econ 101. When we teach principles, this is kind of where we start. Oddly, when economists teach development economics, they forget this exists because they just calculate the amount of aid needed to generate development. But they don't ask some very basic questions. What should we produce and how much of it? What's the best means of producing it and who should get it? Markets solve this problem. They're highly adaptable. F.A. Hayek pointed out, this is his famous paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, that the answer to these questions is not given. It's not out there for some central planner or planners to get. No one knows what should be produced. It's discovered through the market process. So Hayek's point is that, look, we need an environment that allows people to discover what to produce, the best way of producing it, and how to allocate resources. It's continually evolving. It's never stopped. That process never stops. If you understand this logic, it puts hard constraints on what we can do when it comes to helping other societies. You all recognize this, by the way. If I said to you, what's the next iPad going to be? Do you think anyone knows that at this point in time? And you'd say no. But there's people right now investing lots of money in research and development on things they think might be. They're making bets. They have a conjecture about what you and I as consumers might value 1 year, 2 year, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Pure conjecture that will be subject eventually to the profit and loss test. That will be driven by you and I as consumers. That's Hayek's point. So the knowledge isn't out there. The answer to these questions is not given. You can have as many degrees as you want. You don't somehow get the answer to this question. Only the market process is able to answer it. So here's now what aid can and can't do. By definition, aid can increase outputs. This is the logical outcome of if I spend $1 more on something, I get more of it. That is fundamentally different than economic development. What is economic development? It is not increasing outputs. And you say, well, what do you mean? What if I said, I want to make the United States wealthier. I want to increase your development level. I'm going to tax everyone and spend it all on rotary phones and give rotary phones to everyone. Everyone needs multiple rotary phones. I have stimulated the industry. People have jobs. I've increased output. GDP has increased. Would you say that standards of living have increased? Hopefully you'd say no, unless you really, really value rotary phones. Why? Because producing stuff that no one values is waste. What do we want? Resources allocated to a use that consumers, you and I, value. Stated slightly differently, development is the link between production and consumption, not just production. But that means there needs to be a link between entrepreneurs making decisions about what to produce and you and I as consumers being able to provide feedback that they have produced what we value or not. That's the market. But here's the thing. What happens in foreign aid? There's no market. So what happens? A bureaucrat or bureaucrats decides what people get. But that means they are implementing their preferences and imposing them on other people. It would be the equivalent of someone saying, I think you should have rotary phones. Why? Because I'm an expert and that's what I think you should have. But that's not what economic development is. They're two fundamentally different things. People conflate this all the time. Look at development reports by government agencies, and if you flip to the benchmarks of success, what type of things will you see? Number of students enrolled in classrooms, number of buildings built, number of roads paved, number of whatever purchased, number of vaccines distributed. Those are all increases in outputs. No one denies that spending more money on something gets you more of it. What that is not is economic progress, because we can't know economic progress outside the market. So here's what we should start saying. Aid cannot end poverty. What it can do in principle is give some people things that might make them better off. Might, according to the preferences of a bureaucrat who makes the decision on how to allocate resources among people. That's what aid can and can't do. I like this cartoon making fun of the Soviet Union because it captures my point. So here's what we got. It's a 1-ton nail, and here's the factory manager and the worker speaking. And the factory worker says to the manager, who needs a nail this big? It's a 1-ton nail. And the factory manager says, who cares? The important thing is we fulfilled the plan for nails in one fell swoop. What's this getting at? Exactly what I was talking about. How did central planning work? A central planning board said, this quarter you are charged with producing 1 ton of nails. But that's not the relevant question, right? The relevant question is, well, what type of nails do people need? Short ones, long ones. What quality? What type? Right? In a market, no one needs to centrally plan that. So what did they do? They met the output target. Right? What the cartoon's getting at is people are producing things, output's increasing, but it's fake in terms of development. It's actually wasting resources because those resources could have been used to produce something of value. By the way, guys, economists were guilty as possible with this stuff because what happened for years was that economists were tricked that the Soviet Union was outproducing the United States based on GDP figures, until a few economists said, wait, I'm looking at the Soviet Union and I see lots of bombs and tanks, lots of infrastructure, dams and whatnot being produced, but people are waiting in line for like a day to get a roll, if they can get one. Those things don't seem to jive. Increased living standards and starvation. What's going on? Well, government was producing stuff, the bombs, the infrastructure, but they weren't producing things that consumers valued. Output increased, but standards of living didn't. So, for the rest of your life, think about this. You turn around, you'll see 1-ton nails everywhere. Even in the United States, there's 1-ton nails flying around. Lots of stuff being produced that adds no value. But people pretend it does. because they say output's gone up, jobs have increased. That's not the relevant question from an economic standpoint, right? Of course, we could have zero unemployment tomorrow. We could just employ everyone to do stuff. Here, dig a hole with a spoon and fill it back in. Zero unemployment. That's not the relevant question. It's an issue of productivity. Are resources being utilized to produce things that we all value? That's the relevant question. Let me give you a practical example. Healthcare. We have our issues, but other countries have even worse issues. So what do? Well, the US still has state-of-the-art technology despite all our problems. So we get new equipment and we have old equipment. It's not broken, just old. So what do we do with it? Well, we must do something. We send it abroad to poor people and say, there you go, poor people. You can have our secondhand equipment. It's better than nothing. Well, as this article in The Atlantic points out, the equipment, much of it, just sits there unused. Why? Well, number one, there's not technicians that actually know how to use it. Number two, they plug it in, it breaks down, and there's not spare parts. Things you and I take for granted, what economists call complementary goods, which again don't need to be planned. In a market, something breaks down, there's spare parts available. But when you centrally plan things, no one says, oops, I forgot all the other markets that go into producing the good. I forgot the marvel of the market that we discussed earlier. I take it for granted. I use human reason, I send it over. Here's the problem, guys. It's not just that the stuff doesn't work. A hospital in a very poor country is not like a hospital here in the United States where it's multiple stories and there's lots of storage room. It's like this here. This is like the hospital. So now that whole corner is filled with medical equipment. I've just taken up like a quarter of the hospital with garbage. I've actually made people worse off because scarce space that could be used to help people is now sitting there. Or we have to use scarce resources to dispose of this correctly. Now, some of you might be saying, nice job cherry picking an example that supports your point. Well, and I say you are wrong. Because the World Health Organization estimates that up to 70% of equipment across sub-Saharan Africa sits idle, completely unused. So, there's people suffering in these countries. All the humanitarians with their heartstrings being pulled said, we must do something. Let's send our medical equipment over. Did it help? Nope. At best case, it had zero effect. Worst case, it had zero effect and took up scarce resources to either store it or dispose of it, which actually harmed people that were suffering. This is just medical equipment, guys. One of the themes throughout the week that you've been discussing is when you interject politics into things, what happens? One of the common misconceptions people have is that markets are driven by greed and competition, but politics isn't. Politics is about everyone, the public interest. That is incorrect. Why? Because there's always competition by definition. The moment you have scarcity, you have competition. Why? Well, because anytime there's scarcity, decisions need to be made about how to use scarce resources, which means there's competition between alternative uses. Decisions need to be made about how to allocate them. Markets, using the pricing mechanism, is one means of determining that. Politics is another. So there's still competition about how we're going to allocate it. Should we send $100 to Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq? And then within those countries, think about all the different pet projects that NGOs have. Which one should we spend the money to? How is that decision made? Here you go. So what happens? Recipient governments, in the case of bilateral aid, start trying to convince the US government to give them money. Within the donor government, the various government agencies within the US start competing to control policy in other countries because that's how they get bigger budgets. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, they want money from governments because they contract with governments. What do they have to do? Lobby government to get money. I'm more important than the malaria guy over there. Malaria NGO, he got nothing on me, right? I'm delivering shoes or whatever it is that half of them do. Special interest groups. Here's the thing, guys. It's very straightforward. You make available millions of dollars in windfall profits, you're going to get lots of competition. Again, who is the one person or group of people missing from this? The poor people who are suffering have no voice in this whatsoever. Again, you say, that's very strong. Well, let me show you a very straightforward example, which hopefully will make you skeptical of aid, even in the most straightforward sense. There's something called the Food for Peace program. Sounds nice. Who's not for food or peace? Everyone likes it. 1954 it was started. It got kind of jigged under Kennedy. Very straightforward, guys. It is the most, if aid was going to work, this is the one case where it should work. Hungry people, grain. Of course, we know it's U.S. grain because they really care about people, which is why they put in big letters to let you know that they care about people on the side, so we can identify it readily. Very easy. Send the grain over to hungry people and feed them. Sounds pretty straightforward. Well, it's not that straightforward. Why? I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Tide aid. Tide aid works like this. The US government or another government gives aid to people, but it's tied to certain conditions. The idea, the rhetoric behind this is we need to make sure it's not stolen or wasted, so we're going to limit what you can do with it, right? On the face of it, it makes sense. But here's what happens. Who's the aid tied to? By the way, let's step back for a moment. In the poorest countries in the world, what's their dominant industry? Who knows? Agriculture. Hungry people, there's like agriculture right here. If you truly cared about them, you could say, here's $10, go buy some agriculture. Or you might say, well, they may not spend on the agriculture. Okay, send one bureaucrat over there who buys a tomato and then hands it to them. If you truly care about feeding people, because that's the goal of the program, food for peace. Well, here's what happens. The aid is tied, and the way this is set up, it must be bought from US farmers, and it must be sent around the world on US registered ships. What happens? Hungry people across the world have to wait weeks, if not months, to get food. Good for hunger? No. But don't take my word for it. Take the word of the former administrator of USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, under Bush, George W. I've run these operations, and I know that food aid often gets there after everyone's dead. This is the head of the USAID, not some libertarian sitting in a basement. By the way, this is bipartisan. This program is part of the Farm Bill. So do you remember, you probably don't remember, I think it was last summer when all the debate in the US was going on over the Farm Bill. And Obama was saying, I want this untied because I realize this doesn't work the way I want it to work. Presidents going back, it's bipartisan. It's not like Republicans are for and Democrats against. Presidents going back all the way since the program started operating this way have said we need to reform it. But it doesn't get reformed. But the simple answer is as straightforward as can be. Feed the hungry people with the food that's already growing right next door to them. They just don't have, it's an income constraint. Why? Well, fortunately, we have evidence of why. This goes back to the debate over the Farm Bill. And guess what? When there was discussion about untying the aid, untied aid would mean we could just send money directly over to people instead of having to go through this roundabout process. 60 US food organizations sent a strongly worded letter to Obama. Growing manufacturing, bagging, transportation of nutritious, because you can't get nutritious food elsewhere, creates jobs, economic activity at home, somehow provides national defense, and sustains robust domestic constituency. This is the key line here, what we like to call a special interest group. In other words, do it or we won't vote for you. Who has no voice in this process at all? These people. It's not like the equivalent in a market where you're unhappy with your service and you complain to the manager. Who can these people complain to? No one. They have no voice. They're outside the process. Who's the customer? These people are the customers. They tax you, and these people benefit from it. Now, they'll say, no, the people that get the food on the other end, some of them benefit. Point well taken, but we can do an even better job and everyone understands it, yet it doesn't happen. Now, what do you guys think happens when you take this, a relatively simple program like this, and ratchet it up to a much more complex program? Like, we're going to rebuild the infrastructure of this program, and then we get into things like we were talking about last lecture with nation building, and then we're going to administer vaccines to all these people. Imagine this multitudes greater, and it's the same exact logic. And it's exactly what economics would predict would happen, and it's what humanitarians pretend doesn't happen, and they're like, we'll do a better job next time. I went through bureaucracy already, so I won't go through this again, but you all know lots of examples. It's not hard. In our own backyard, Hurricane Katrina, domestic humanitarian crisis. We have the most well-developed bureaucracy for the sole purpose of responding to domestic crises. It's called FEMA. You all know all the stuff that happened. Waste, fraud, miscalculation, and miscoordination. Haiti, you can look up reports if you're interested in this, if you want to cry. Look up reports, you can see all the waste going on there. Unintended consequences. So people say, okay, look, maybe we'll waste some of it, but some of it gets there, so it's still worth it. But what about the unintended consequences? Remember, I said one of the things you always have to ask yourself is, and then what? People just pretend things don't happen. Let me ask you a question. Let's start with this. The poorest countries in the world tend to have the worst governments in the world. It's just a fact. Now, it's a correlation, so you can argue causation in both directions. You can say the government's the cause of the poverty, or you can say they're poor, therefore the government can't reform. Proponents of aid take the latter. They say we need to give money to the government in order for it to reform because they're too poor to reform. Here's the fundamental dilemma. What's a bad government? A bad government is one where power is centralized in the hand of an elite with no or very few constraints on them. What do you expect to happen when there's unconstrained power? The abuse of power. This is not unique to poor countries. This is the fundamental paradox of government that the founding fathers in the US and people before them had raised, which is you need to simultaneously empower government and constrain it so that it cannot utilize that power to abuse its own citizens. So you say, okay, poor government needs money to reform. Here, poor government, here's millions of dollars. Now, if you believe those individuals are purely other regarding, they are truly public spirited, then they'll say, okay, now we're going to constrain ourselves. Alternatively, you say, well, they respond to incentives, there's no constraints, you've just given them billions of dollars, they are going to steal it and use it for their own benefits. In doing that, you have reinforced the status quo and incentivized corruption. But not all poor countries have strong bad governments. Some are characterized by chaos, weak political institutions. What happens when you throw a bag of money down in the middle? People are going to fight to get as much of the money as they can. Dependency effect, or what's called the Samaritan's dilemma. This is a fundamental problem with any kind of handout, which is the minute you give people aid to help them, you might help them, but you also have disincentivized them becoming self-sufficient because they become dependent on the handout. We can think of many other examples as well. This is from a recent issue of the New York Review of Books about writing about Uganda. And just one of many examples you can find about this where the injection of huge amounts of money has just led to pure straight up corruption. And here's the thing, even though supposed humanitarians, and if you ask, just the average college student, you say, do you think we should help people? Yes. And you say, well, tell me what's going on in Uganda right now. What happened to the money since you care so much about people there? The people don't know. They just say stuff. We should help them. But then they actually don't have any kind of purpose, or they don't actively engage in accountability to even track where the money's going, let alone vote for politicians based on this. So summing up, I brought this up before. Here's the standard thing. You must do something. You have to do something to help people. It's either a moral obligation or I feel like it. The first thing to remember, and this kind of sums up all three lectures quite well, is that you need to get out of your head the idea of the myth of the man in charge. People tend to say, look, if someone is not controlling things, then it's chaos. If someone is not creating development over there can't be development. The insight of spontaneous order theorizing, though, is just the opposite. What we want is general rules that allow people to engage in discovery. So get this out of your head. But here's the other thing, guys. Let's say someone says, so you would do nothing. You just would let poor people starve. You just want people to die in genocide. You say, no, actually, I have some great policy recommendations that we can do to help the poorest people in the world. And guess what? They overcome a lot of the issues Coyne talked about because they don't entail centrally planning the economy and they don't entail dealing with foreign interest groups. Let's reduce trade barriers and barriers to migration domestically. Let's let the poorest people in the world trade their goods and services with the United States, with the EU. Let's get rid of something called the Common Agricultural Policy, which is one of the most devastating effects on the poorest people in the world. Because as you guys pointed out to me, the main industry in these countries is agriculture. What happens? Producers in these countries don't like the fact that they're outcompeted by producers who do a better job at a lower price abroad. So they lobby government to raise trade barriers up. Who suffers? The poorest people in the world. If you truly care about the poorest people, you should be actively be an activist for getting rid of trade barriers. A form of trade barrier is preventing people from coming into the United States or other developed countries. If you truly care about human well-being, you should advocate reducing those barriers. Now, by the way, let me give you one example because you might say, well, those are long-term development things. What about short-term humanitarian crises? We have a great natural experiment. Haitian earthquake happens in 2010. The World Bank this comes from, estimates there are 200,000 Haitians here, legally. They had papers. Their papers expired. So the US government wasn't going to send them back because their country was basically destroyed. So they granted them temporary protected status. They were allowed to continue to work here. Those 200,000 individuals, it is estimated, sent back $360 million in remittances, which is money sent back from the land you are working back to your homeland, in the year 2010, which was more money than the US government gave in foreign aid. What if that number had been 300,000 or 400,000? Because of course people say, well, if you lower migration barriers, everyone's going to come in. Well, we can have that discussion. But what if we just, on the margin, lower it? Still make people better off. So there are ways to help people who are suffering, which doesn't require an outward orientation. There's them and there's us, and we need to fix them, which is how the last lecture and this lecture tried to emphasize people think about these things. Let's focus on what we can do. What's the response to the point I just raised? Well, one response will be, look, those things will never happen precisely because there's interest groups that have an incentive in protecting their industry. And I say, point well taken. But for that very reason, you should be against every single foreign intervention you can think of. Because if politicians in the United States are unable to manipulate or maneuver through the domestic political structure to lower trade barriers or migration barriers, what gives you any confidence that they can maneuver through both domestic and international political systems to get the outcome by going over there? And I would suggest they can't, because the problem is that much more complex. So for the same reason you would reject these policies here, you would have to reject them abroad. I'm going to stop here and we can discuss whatever it is with this or any of the other stuff that you want to talk about. Yes?
So as far as government goes, are you also against like smaller groups, like mission trips, but not even just mission trips, but like smaller groups going to like different places, like Haitian, or like, because I've gone to Haiti 3 years in a row during January, and we've helped build back one of the schools that got destroyed, and we use like their resources.
Mm-hmm.
Like we picked rocks, put them in things, made cement, and like built blocks with them, and like we'd come back the next year and they would have so much more built, but they would have to stop because they would end with resources.
Right.
And so are you also against because like you keep talking about how with bigger corporations there's also like all this other stuff that they try to get out of it. When you just go to like the basics, the bare minimums, is that helpful, or is that still hurting them, or what?
It's a great question. So the question is one about, basically one of scope and type. The scope being the scale of the initiative, and also the type, NGOs versus government. One thing I want to say by starting is, one of the trends that's happened since World War II in humanitarianism is that NGOs have become increasingly dependent on government for funding. So more than ever now, NGOs receive government contracts. And it was actually the government that started this, because the government said, look, people say government's inefficient, NGOs are efficient, so let's funnel our money through the NGOs. But then NGOs, by the way, are for non-governmental organizations. The problem, of course, is they're governmental organizations then. They become subject to all the rules and regulations and bureaucratic murkiness that other agencies are required of. Exactly, so I was just making that distinction. So now we've made one distinction. So I would be suspect of those type of NGOs, the ones that receive government funding, because I think it falls prey to the same type of analysis. Independent NGOs, I like more on a relative scale, precisely for the reason you raise, which is they need to raise their own resources, they need to convince people to give them things, and oftentimes, but not always, they tend to be more likely to listen to small-scale local communities what they need. The problem is, and you really pointed it out, this wasn't your intention, but you pointed out, which is, look, if you're a government agency and you go in front of Congress and you're testifying, they say, well, what have you done with all our money? You say, look, Coyne said to do these small-scale things, so we went back 3 years in a row to build this schoolhouse. And they'll say, that's all you've done? So what do they try to do? We've built electricity to this many millions of people. They make grandiose things which are more likely to fail. It is these small-scale things, which oftentimes take longer, but they're actually things they might need, right, in this case, and they're more likely to be used over time. So from that standpoint, we can imagine cases where it would be more effective. Now, that said, I wanted to make one more point, which is there is still the fundamental distinction between economic growth and output. And so keep that in mind. NGOs can't create development or end poverty any more than government can, because they're just increasing outputs that they think people need. Now, they might have they might create an education system that then goes on to produce educated people that then contribute further down the line, perhaps. And that could then contribute to it, but that's the building itself is just increasing output. That said, by the way, I should also note, because this question's come up a lot, I'm not against charity or giving. I don't want to come across like that, because a lot of people say, well, you like hate people and don't want to give money to them. I'm like, do whatever you want with your money. All I'm saying is understand there's constraints and incentives. But there's these websites now like Giving Well, I think it's called, that ranks, there's these ranking websites that try to rank private charities based on the effectiveness of how they spend their money. There's also now a movement, one of them's givedirectly.com, I believe it's called, where you can, instead of, let's say you couldn't go to Haiti for whatever reason, you just can't go for personal reasons or whatever. You can go on this website, and instead of going through governments, it's like a Craigslist for humanitarian aid. So there might be Billy who needs money for school, and he writes up his thing, and then you can wire him money through the equivalent of like PayPal, $10, $20. And some of the websites have it where you get a return on your investment, but some where it's just a pure transfer. And that's, again, a direct transfer as compared to this. It's avoiding all this stuff where you have this huge bureaucratic apparatus where people are kind of left out. And it also tends to incentivize you as the donor to pay a little more attention to who you're giving your money to. Yeah?
What's your opinion on the London Club and the Paris Club?
I don't know. I don't have an opinion. I never thought about them. What do you think about them?
Well, I'm just like wondering, like, do you believe that they're better as a larger group for the multilateral aid because they do help competitors of the global south? So I don't know if you have an opinion or not.
I don't really. All international organizations, they just fall under the purview of international organizations that supposedly solve collective problems. I don't really have a strong opinion. It's unclear to me that you need these things. You know, people point out like global financial stability and whatnot, but they also create tons of problems as well through the conditions they put on countries, but also through the moral hazard problem we were discussing earlier, the too big to fail type logic. But that said, I haven't studied those particular cases, so I don't have a strong opinion. Yes, sir.
You talked about lowering the migration barriers. How would that work? Like, what would you do?
You are free to come here.
But like, would you give visas or what?
In my ideal world, you don't need a visa. You just come here if you like. I think every argument people raise against immigration, there's a easier way to address it. So people tend to go to the extremes. So they'll say things like, they're going to be on the welfare system, they're going to do this, therefore zero, or very limited immigration. But if you're truly concerned about that, here's a solution. Let's say you're worried about welfare. You're allowed to come here, but you are not allowed to use the welfare system for 25 years. But you're free to come here if you want. They'll say, they'll vote and all of a sudden the US will turn into Mexico, or whatever people say. Because that's the kind of things I hear. I'm like, okay, if you're truly concerned about that, would you be willing to do something where you're welcome to come here, but you can't vote? Still, they'd benefit from being in a better country and benefit from all the economic benefits. So there's always an easier response than just saying, okay, some bad might happen, therefore zero, or very limited. And so that's kind of how I envision it. Politically, I realize what I'm saying is silly because right now it's near impossible to get this implemented, any kind of immigration reform. But that's kind of my point in some sense, because if it's that hard to get that kind of thing passed domestically, imagine internationally how hard it is to get policies passed. Someone over here? No. Anyone else? Yeah.
What I heard that you were talking about, like those companies that like are in favor of microfinancing for countries, but like especially different businesses, not just giving away the money. So you'd say that's okay?
Well, yes and no. When I say it's okay, by the way, I'm not like endorsing it. What I'm saying is this is what I can tell you within my framework. I just want to make that clear. Microfinance started very similar to the idea that I was saying to you, which is small scale loans to people that otherwise didn't have access to capital markets. And I like that idea. I think that can work. Over time, though, what's happened with a lot of the microfinance organizations is they've become intertwined with government. Government started putting regulations on them about interest rates they could charge. They started actually providing money to the banks that would lend them out. And the minute you become intertwined with government, you just start falling prey to all this stuff because you just become part of the massive government organ. But here's the other thing I want to emphasize to you guys. When you talk about private charity, when you talk about microfinance, it's not that those things can't provide short-term relief, but always keep in mind the fundamental question, why do they need this assistance in the first place? They need it because they're poor. Then the fundamental question is, why are they poor? And what I'd like to suggest, and I'm sure this has come up already, is they're poor because they don't have property rights. There's no incentive to engage in innovation and investment in the country. And that's really what it comes down to at the core of it. Now, it's a hard problem to get the change to move towards that. But it's always important to keep that in mind, that these things are at best a short-term fix. They're not this is why I'm saying it's different than development. Absent a broader institutional change that protects people's property rights, the people will continue to suffer. The fundamental problem is not resolved.
One last question.
Or not if there isn't one.
Lunch
Well-
early is always fine.
Sure.
There you go. Thank you very much.